Here we go. Chapter 7 of Who Was George Washington, called Hard Times. Here we go. Most of the battles in the war were fought in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. In late fall of 1778, the Continental Army won an important victory in Saratoga, New York. After receiving the good news, Washington led 10,000 of his men westward in Pennsylvania. They would set up a camp until spring, when battles would resume. He picked a place called Valley Forge. It was easy to defend. Also, his spies could keep an eye on British troops in nearby Philadelphia. The months at Valley Forge should have been a time for the troops to rest up and regain their strength. However, the weather turned bitter cold. The huts the soldiers built had no heat. The snow made all the wood too damp to burn. In letters to the Continental Congress, Washington kept begging for help. He needed uniforms, shoes, and food. Washington was told to stop his whining complaints. How bad was it for the soldiers? Many were dressed only in rags. Some had no clothes at all, just a tattered blanket. Sometimes a soldier had to borrow someone else's rags to go on duty. Officers who had shoes poured whiskey in them to prevent frostbite. Common soldiers often went barefoot. Washington reported seeing blood from their feet in the snow. Some soldiers' frozen feet turned black and had to be amputated. That's just a picture of the soldiers in the cold. There was no food for the horses. Most fell down dead. There wasn't enough food for the soldiers either. They would go for days without even so much as a bite of meat. They were near starvation. As always, Martha came to stay with her husband and the troops at winter camp. Everyone called her Lady Washington. She couldn't stand the sight of blood and was known for saying that she shuddered at the sound of a gunshot. Yet she knew being there meant a lot to the soldiers as well as to her husband. At Valley Forge, she cared for the sick and would leave small gifts for them. Still, a quarter of the troops, 2,500 of them, died from disease. What is even more terrible is that the suffering at Valley Forge was unnecessary. Pennsylvania farmers had recently harvested their crops. It had been a very good year. They could have supplied the troops with food and clothes, but chose instead to reap bigger profits by selling to the British. Terrible as the time was at Valley Forge, conditions at the winter camp in Morristown the following year were worse. Soldiers were deserting. Six soldiers were dying in huge numbers. Washington's army was down to 8,000 men, and of those, fewer than 3,000 were well enough to fight. More bad news came that summer. In the city of Charleston, South Carolina, fell to the British. After that, there was an American defeat in Savannah, Georgia. And then in the fall, Washington learned that Benedict Arnold, a daring and trusted general, had gone over to the British side. Arnold did it for money, and to this day is considered the worst traitor in American history. Tories. Looking back to a long time ago, it is easy to think that everyone in the colonies was fighting together, that they all believed in the same cause. But that isn't so. Not all Americans shared in the spirit of '76. John Adams, who became the second president, estimated that 1/3 of the colonists were for independence, 1/3 wanted to remain British, these colonists were called Tories, and 1/3 didn't care much one way or the other. During the war, many Tories were punished as traitors. Sometimes they were tarred and feathered. After hot tar was poured on them, they were coated with white feathers. Then they were hoisted up on a rail and ridden out of town. After the war, most Tories ended up moving to Canada or sailing back to England. This is a very horrific thing that they did. Very terrifying. Chapter 8, Victory. The Continental Army was in shambles in the spring of 1781. Yet only 7 months later, the war ended. One battle changed everything. For a long time, Washington had dreamed of retaking New York City, which had been captured by the British. Washington wanted a big win, badly. But wisely, he now focused on victory in the South, in Virginia. The British commanding general, Lord Charles Cornwallis, had just moved his entire army to Yorktown, Virginia. It was on a peninsula, which meant his army was surrounded on 3 sides by water. As American ships headed into the area, a fleet of French ships joined them. Then Washington sent 2,000 troops to join forces with French soldiers at the tip of the peninsula. All told, Washington had the strength of 21,000 men. Cornwallis had only about 7,000. Cornwallis's army was not only outnumbered, it was hemmed in on all sides. The British were trapped. The battle began, and on October 17th, on the 8th day of bombardment, General Cornwallis surrendered. 2 days later, George Washington sat on his favorite horse, Nelson, watching the defeated British soldiers march out of Yorktown. He did not realize right then that this victory spelled the end of the war, but it had. The Americans had won independence. So this is a picture of the Battle of Yorktown, which is in the Chesapeake Bay, which is in Virginia. You'll learn a lot more about that when you're older. And this is like a zoomed in picture of it, with the British and the French and the colonists all fighting and where they were. It took 2 years before a treaty between Britain and the United States was signed in Paris, France. As soon as word of the treaty came, Washington said farewell to his army. First, he said goodbye to the ordinary soldiers. He called them a patriotic band of brothers. A month later, he met with his officers in Fraunces Tavern in New York City. The tavern is still there. He broke down in tears. Here were men who had stood by him through the long years of war. Each officer stood before him for a handshake and then a kiss on the cheek. George Washington resigned from the army. On Christmas Eve, 1783, he arrived home. Martha was there at Mount Vernon to greet him. He planned to take up farming again and spend the rest of his days in Virginia. He was 51 years old. It was time to retire. The Treaty of Paris. The war ended in October 1781. The Treaty of Paris wasn't signed until September of 1783. It's like 2 years. The treaty recognized that the United States was a separate, free country. The boundaries of the new country would go from the Great Lakes in Maine to Florida, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. A famous artist of the time named Benjamin West was to paint a group portrait of the British and the Americans who signed the treaty. The painting, however, was never finished. Although the Americans, including Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, posed for West, the British refused to be in the picture. So there's our 13 colonies. You might be familiar with that. You'll definitely be familiar with it in 4th grade. When you go to 4th grade, for sure. They're going to teach you all about it. And then here's the picture talking about it. It was never finished. It's never finished. All right, looks like we can start chapter 9. But I don't think we'll finish. Chapter 9, A Brand New Country. George Washington was living again in his beloved Virginia. He was still the most famous man in America, just as he had been all through the war. A constant stream of visitors arrived at Mount Vernon. Everyone wanted to meet His Excellency. What brought Washington out of retirement? Well, the country was floundering. The government was weak. It didn't have the power to raise taxes or control trade or mark state barriers. Washington said it was as clear to me as ABCs that the new country needed a much stronger system. In 1787, at a convention held in Philadelphia, the Constitution was written. It mapped out the kind of government George Washington hoped for. There would be three branches of power: a strong president, a Congress to pass the laws, and a Supreme Court to rule on whether laws were fair. No one branch would have too much power. Even before the first election for president was held, everyone knew George Washington would win. The election system that was different from the way it is now. Electors from the different states were chosen. Each had 2 votes. Everyone voted for Washington, so he became president. John Adams came in second with 34 votes, so he became vice president. George Washington received the news on April 14th, 1789. 2 days later, he set out for the temporary capital, which was in New York City. There, he would take the oath of office. He said there were no words to express how anxious he felt. He was walking on untrodden ground. He meant there was no path for him to follow, because no one had ever been president before. And that is where we will pause for today.